This is my full interview with Socialism Done Left. I did this interview along with two others for my latest video, Is the Left Divided? So go check that out if you want to. But I have some questions down. It's gonna be more of informal. I'm not gonna just like stay to the questions completely, but I have like some things written down.
Sure.
Um, so can you like kind of just like uh give an introduction, kind of just define yourself politically?
Sure. I'm Aiden. I run the channel Socialism Done Left. The political ideologies I would come closest to would be a form of like progressive market socialism. Another term that I quite like, the idea of is the developmental state. Market socialism here basically means like a worker cooperative and state-owned market um, that seeks to serve, and plus nationalization for some sectors, trying to serve everyone. And then the developmental state idea is just that the state can actively intervene to improve the quality of markets, which is something from like Mariana Mazzucato. It is often used to describe the models that you saw. I know it sounds weird to conglomerate them all, but like Japan, South Korea, China, modern day,
Yeah.
Taiwan, all have these sort of same structures. So those would be like the economic sort of ideas. And how I get there, I would say that I'm a democratic socialist or a reformist. I generally say that like I'm in favor of I'm totally fine. I support civil disobedience. I'm willing to support stuff like the BLM actions. I think that violence that occurs generally tends to hurt the movement. So I would say like violence bad. That's like kind of the cutting off point. Um, but pretty much everything to like the nonviolent side of violence is something that I think can be useful for getting the message out there and advancing leftist movements. So I also therefore include a whole lot of electoralism. I think that if you talk to some people, you will find anti-electoral people. So that might be something that some will disagree on.
Yeah. Yeah, I assume that you're more of like the kind of like market socialist uh guess ish type, mainly because I haven't looked as I've seen some of your videos, but I haven't looked specifically in everything like you believe in and like the specifics. But I have like seen some people because again going into this, I've seen some people they're like, oh my god, how can this guy even call himself a socialist? The market socialists aren't even real socialists, like shit like that.
Yeah, no, I'm
Yeah,
definitely a market socialist. I was actually going to have a whole discussion about that with a few other leftist creators, but some of them ghosted me. So,
yeah, that's
um,
um,
yeah, no, that's a point of division.
yeah, that is. Uh, that's something I found. That is something I found kind of funny, is because most of the divisions that I've seen among the left are like things like how to run a what a leftist society would look like, the specifics behind it, and it's like I'm not like to get doomerish like everything.
Hmm.
I think that doesn't help anyone, but most of these things that a lot of leftists are divided on, most
Are so
likely
far
or
away.
most likely might probably won't even happen in our lifetimes. I mean, I would like to think they would, but just like most likely they won't. So it is it's not like something that's like very like in the moment. Um, yeah, but the my
Yeah,
first
no, I mean that's
there you go.
definitely. I think that most people that I think are reasonable take the approach of the immortal science of James Medlock, which is that
Mhm.
you are a sock dem in the voting booth, you're a sock dem in the streets, and then whatever your actually ideology is. So for James Medlock or I guess it would be like dem sock in the sheets. Or like ML in the sheets or whatever, the short term, you aren't going to be able to get these ideologies through. You should be willing to use reformist measures like electoralist measures to gain popularity, influence, and the changing of people's minds. So I think that's the rational take. But again, some people do disagree with this. I have talked with those people. So
Um, but my first actual question I wrote down, I have written, what is the number one thing that the average leftist at home can do to help the leftist cause overall, and how much importance do you put on local organizations and planning, whether it be direct action or electorally?
I guess probably the most important thing you could do would be joining either a local TSA, and that is involved in like canvassing, like year-round canvassing, or this is something that like I constantly show the book "Politics Is for Power" by Hirsch. He suggests also that you can either set up or join your local Democratic district, um, and you can use that to get funds for year-round canvassing. And basically, the suggestion is that like having grassroots on the ground, like sort of constant political organizing, is a really great way to get something like 800 or so people actively involved in the political process, and that can swing votes, that can swing districts or something. It's not insubstantial. So I guess that would be the most meaningful thing you could do there. On the other level, if you have like a switch to suddenly get like 1 million followers on YouTube or something, there is a lot of evidence that media changes people's minds. Even stuff like op-eds can change people's minds. So if you want like grassroots on the ground volunteering, it's communal organizations, and I think it is a mixture of direct action, like personal connections, charity, trust sort of networks, and also just like going out and canvassing, talking to people, deep canvassing, which is this tactic where you just talk to people for a really long time, basically, as opposed to like normal canvassing or shallow canvassing, where you just say, "Hey, go vote, please." That seems to be very effective. On the whole other side of the scale, again, in like media does matter. If you can accumulate media power, that is another way to change people's minds and maybe in turn get those people to go and do local organizing. So I think those are like the two things you could do. Um, yeah,
Yeah. Um. Yeah. I mean, yeah. That's
run for
something
and
that's
win
really.
federal office, implement your policies. That's the third one. Really easy. Just be an upstart AOC, happen to upseat your like 6 term incumbent, like a Democratic senator or whatever, or House congressperson. Just do that real quick. Those are the
Yeah.
three
There's
options.
also. I mean, also like you could donate to those organizations. Some of those
Yeah.
organizations have things where you can phone bank and text bank and things like that. Which I mean, I guess that would be a lot easier for people if they're, I guess, in a very small population area or a very deep red part of the country that probably doesn't have as many organizations. I think, like, I'm assuming it probably is harder to join like a local DSA group or attend meetings or anything if you're like in Wyoming. I'm
Well, and that's
assuming.
why
Um,
that's one of the reasons why Hirsch suggests the Democratic district thing. Like
yeah.
even if you're like the super hard committed leftist, often Democratic district offices can get a decent amount of money, like $10,000 or something,
Hmm.
to help pay for, it could be you, it could be like someone that you hire to be this sort of year-round organizer and canvasser. And that's really crucial, I guess, is one of the big things he suggests, is just having that infrastructure constantly there, constantly getting people involved, is very different than the usual kind of canvassing where you show up like the day before election day and you tell people to go vote, in that it actually seems to change minds. The other just gets people to turn out. It just increases turnout by 1%, whereas the other genuinely persuades people. Um, so,
Yeah. Uh, Currently, what is your biggest concern politically, whether it be for the world, your country, the working class, or something that is just a red flag or something of concern?
I think that the biggest threat is probably the U.S. sliding to fascism. Like, no cap, I guess.
Yep. That would
Uh,
check off the country and the world.
I think, and the working class, and probably like I think all the boxes. I guess I think there's a reasonable risk that the Republican Party becomes more dominated by people who are willing to break the institutions to obtain either personal or ideological power. That's really worrying. Um, and I think that if the US turns fascist, basically the world's going to go fascist for like 20, 30 years at least or something. Like we've already seen rising fascism around the world, in part due to a lot of money and propaganda and like learning from the American experience. Part of the reason that Bolsonaro got elected in
Yeah.
Brazil is a whole bunch of American money, and American evangelists directly supported Brazilian evangelists and Brazilian right wing radios and so on. I think also if America goes fascist, you'll see a lot of intervention to support those sort of authoritarian regimes. So I think it would be like a mini dark age for democracy, like 10, 20 years of decline for democracy. That I think is probably the greatest global threat. Um, yeah.
Yeah,
I,
I couldn't even imagine what our foreign policy would look like if we became a fascist state. I mean, it's already bad now. I can't
well, I
even
mean,
imagine what it would look like.
I think part of it's also like with Trump, it's an incompetent fascist, but a competent
Yeah.
fascist probably knows that he shouldn't alienate like the CIA, the FBI, and all of the people who are involved in like the power operations of the United States. Trump's weird anti-intervention is one of those things that actually probably weakened him. A competent fascist would probably not discontinue any of the imperialism abroad. Some people seem to have this view that like right populism is anti-interventionist. Probably
Hmm.
not if it's actually effective
No,
at
no.
implementing a fascist regime. Um, Also, and then there's the whole meme like Trump drone bombed many more people. Trump was involved in like numerous civilian deaths. We don't actually even know how many civilians he killed because he stopped the publication of that
Yeah,
data.
yeah.
Um, yeah, I don't know. that frustrates me. But whatever. I guess the point is just like, even if you think, maybe Trump good, probably competent fascist not good. um, so
Um, so briefly, just so again, that's another thing just to bridge a gap because I think too people get too divided over labels and things like that.
mhm.
What is your ideal economic and political system in more detail?
Sure. I mean, so like I said, I'm a market socialist. I like the idea of the developmental economy. So the suggestion there is something like a large market sector, basically dominated by cooperatives or state-owned corporations, um, and then some nationalized firms. So like it seems like a lot of sectors, like say healthcare, education, transportation, a lot of like telecommunication, basically stuff that we think of as like infrastructure or public goods. Those tend to do better with state control, whether it be by like direct nationalization or like a number of state firms that can like compete against each other. Um, Basically because they're natural monopolies. That's like the idea is that competition doesn't work well in these sorts of sectors. So for example, in like say fiber optics or something, it's expensive to lay the same cable twice to the same home. So it's very hard for multiple firms to compete to laying fiber optics to the same home. The same is true, even more so for stuff like utilities, like electricity, or infrastructure, like railroads. So that seems naturally to fall in like the nationalization category. And then the market category is where competition seems more useful because you can have hundreds or thousands or potentially hundreds of thousands of businesses all competing to provide the same service. The utility of competition seems to be that it's correlated with like a decrease in prices because like even Marx would fucking tell you this, that like when corporations have to fight each other, when firms have to fight each other, they have to reduce prices to try and gain market share. That's good because lower prices benefits the consumer. It's also good because it seems to drive innovation. There's a significant correlation of like small firms and higher competition in a sector with higher innovation. Conversely, again, to pivot over towards like the nationalization side, if I had to recommend a book here, it would be Mariana Mazzucato, The Entrepreneurial State. The state can also play an enormous role in advancing R&D. Particularly, competition is good at innovation that's close to the market, like making a product like 5% better. But the government is really, really, really good with basic research.
Yeah.
So stuff that takes like 60, 70 years to develop it to be fully mature. So NASA, if we didn't have it, we probably wouldn't have satellites today. We wouldn't have had lasers today. We might not have had miniaturized computers today. The basic thesis of Matsukuto's book is that everything in your iPhone was ultimately funded by government research about 50 years back. It's called basic science. The government's really, really good at basic science, and the public sector is absolutely terrible at it. So I guess the summary of it, I guess, is like a mixed ownership with cooperatives and the public sector. I guess other big things, big word like buzz phrases or whatever I want to get in are like social wealth funds. So the state should own. There shouldn't just be cooperatives. The state should indirectly own a bunch of cooperatives via social wealth funds and people's nationalization or democratic nationalization. I don't just want firms to be owned by the state and then managed by representatives who then indirectly appoint someone to run a corporation that runs your life. I think that corporations should have, like nationalized firms, should have directly elected boards, basically. So, for example, if it's like British Rail, where it's like one rail service for the entire country, you probably want that to be democratic. And I guess if I had to sum all this up, I think that the fundamental thesis of socialism is economic democracy. The question is simply how best to deliver it and how most efficiently to deliver it to sort of maximize democracy and maximize the benefits to everyone. Or another phrase I quite like is more prosperity for more people.
Yeah. It's a bit
I know
long.
there's a lot. I'm sorry.
um, but no, I mean
All right. Were you looking for shorter answers or longer ones? I should ask.
Either is fine. You can answer how you want to. I kind of say it can be hard to be like, yeah, say what your ideal economic and political system is. Now say it within like 2 sentences. Like you're not gonna be able to do that.
I think that's actually a really useful thing. If I had to say one thing, like one of the things I do on my channel is socialism done short. I
Yeah,
tried to say that socialism is like you can describe it in like 8 words, and ideally it should be something like political democracy, workplace democracy, economic democracy, and class compression. And like that's fundamentally those are the things that I care about. But that's not very meaningful for actually describing the policies that you'd want to see. So
yeah. I mean, it is.
yeah,
It can be effective though because I mean the overall public does care more about. It does seem like they care more about catchphrases, buzzwords than something to rally behind than like an economic like policy or like the actual explanation of like an entire political system. a lot of people don't have really the this sounds kind of disparaging. Like I'm not. I don't mean it in that way. A lot of people don't have like the attention span to kind of like soak all that in or
Yeah,
get.
probably not.
Yeah,
Most people don't read theory. Most people don't even read politics. So it's fair.
yeah. Um, I think this is a good follow up question. Who or what are your biggest influences when it comes to your political beliefs?
I give a spectrum of them. I would name
Hmm.
Paul Cockshott, who is a Scottish reformist Marxist-Leninist who talks about computation and central planning. I would talk about Mariana Mazzucato, who talks about the role of the state in improving markets, improving like research and development in particular, but just also more generally creating more efficient markets. I would talk about maybe it's not necessarily Meidner's like there's a guy named Rudolf Meidner from Sweden. Um, it's not like he wrote a lot of books. Some particularly some of just the policies he talked about, which is like the Rudolf the Rein Meidner labor plan, which is what Sweden had for a while. It was a form of sectoral bargaining, and the Meidner plan to eventually socialize the economy. Um, and I guess maybe one last one would be Darren Acemoglu, who basically his entire life in economics has been trying to argue about the importance of democracy as an institution for basically long-term economic growth. His fundamental thesis is that good institutions, which are highly informed by good democracy, tend to be the real drivers of long-term growth by enabling all of the other things we care about, like innovation and human capital. So I guess in short, it would be what Darren Acemoglu, Mariana Mazzucato, Paul Cockshott, and I missed one, but you can figure it out if you've heard
Yeah,
the rest of
that's nice. Um,
them.
um, what? Moving on to like a more, I guess, foreign policy based thing. Um, it's a bit of a loaded question, but how do we, I guess, overall globally, how do we prevent and stop future imperialist actions by the U.S.?
I mean, I think uh, is this. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear
Sorry, I couldn't tell if there was lag. I think the answer probably comes from the United States itself. It seems like there's only two options. Either one, you win a revolution in a sufficiently big country that you can fight the United States, and then you're in a position like the Soviet Union, in which you fight a really long, like protracted battle where you use autarky, like economic policies that don't use imports. You close yourself off from the rest of the world, and you like kind of descend into authoritarianism. That seems to really suck. So the model of resisting the United States just doesn't seem to work. Resisting the imperialist powers, they're just too fucking strong. This is one of the reasons that I say that I think that not revolution, that socialist reform in particular has to come from the first world, because it has to. It just doesn't seem like third world revolutions can survive without being crushed. Um, so I think that fundamentally you have to change the United States by, I mean, in short, changing the people who run it. Moving the people who run it left, moving them in a way where they don't want to destroy like workers' movements and workers' rights abroad. Um, yeah, it's a simple one.
you. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned revolution because it's the next question, and that's the next question. So, uh,
Mhm.
do you think a revolution is necessary for a social society to happen? And do you think a revolution in the U.S. can even happen?
I think to answer the second part, no, we have no examples of successful socialist revolutions in liberal democracies. Zero, not one. Even if you think that revolution was like the right way to do it in China or Russia or whatever, even if you think Lenin or Mao were totally right in their theory, that theory doesn't seem applicable to high income first world democracies. So on the first bit, is it necessary? I would also say no. I guess which necessarily follows from me being a reformist and think it's impossible and not
Yeah.
being a doomer. Um, so I don't think it's necessary. I do think that you can gradually change all the institutions we have from one type to another. If you want a direct analogy, I would point to that of England. There was no true civil war, no like large scale mass death, mass killing, mass fighting after 1649. And yet the aristocratic elite was withered and whittled away by the rising bourgeois elite, who built a bourgeois democracy that, in turn, I argue, and this is, I think, part of the thesis of Acemoglu, was in turn partially replaced and whittled away with the modern rise of like the welfare state and like the mostly worker and poor dominated democracies that we have today. I think that you can look at the transfer of power in some of these countries from the aristocrats to like the bourgeois and see in it blueprints for how we should do the same things today. The ways you do it, you take away the power of the bourgeois, be it like control of the media, be it control of wealth, and you have to slowly transfer that over to workers' hands. And the more power you take, the harder it is for them to take it back.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, I think that might be like the one of the biggest divides on the left. I think is revolution and
Hmm.
reform. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah, definitely. I I think I would agree with the fact that probably in its current state, a revolution in the U.S. is not possible at least anytime soon, and I don't know if it ever will be.
Yeah.
Um, it's probably possible in like a lot of countries in South America and other third world countries. It definitely seems like it's a lot easier to at least attempt a revolution there than it would be in the U.S. Or a wealthier nation. It also is just a lot
I,
harder to get people to participate in something like that. I mean, and we can already see this right now because even when it comes to like protests, it just seems like a lot of Americans just absolutely hate protesting the government.
mhm.
So it's
Well, I think the really simple reason is as people's incomes rise, they are less willing to put their lives on the line. What started the Russian Revolution? It was riots over bread rationing. People wanted food. They wanted like basic necessities.
mhm.
In America, there's food insecurity, but it's not food insecurity for like the average individual. It's food insecurity for like the extremely marginalized. People just aren't on the verge of starvation, the verge of like the suffering that people were in other countries when they were led to revolution. In fact, in many ways, most of the revolutions of history have been about food. 1848 was all about food. Um, so I think, in short, the food security, income security, housing security, all of these things are going up over time. Revolution gets harder and harder.
Yeah, I've always found it better ironic because like when the country was founded, it was kind of like, oh, the people of this country can overthrow the government if it doesn't
Hmm.
fit our necessities and everything like that. And then, I mean, it's like the exact opposite today. Like no one is willing to actually um do
Yeah,
anything
well,
meaningful.
and the reason I say, like, the reason I just point to it is there have been no successful revolutions in a liberal democracy is because I think it's telling. Like, it's been like 150 years or so. And if you look at liberal democracies, maybe you set some standard, they have to be like older than 10 years or 20 years or so. There just aren't successful revolutions. Um, they just don't exist. They only really happen in unstable or newly birthed democracies, like liberal democracies.
Yeah, it's
Uh,
a lot of it also has to do with when it comes to people not willing to protest or anything like that, or
yeah.
speak out against I guess inequality, either economically or just anything. It's a lot of it has to do with propaganda, as in
Hmm.
a lot of people are kind of fooled into thinking they're doing well. So your average American can be doing a lot better than they actually are doing right now, and they deserve a lot more than they get. But they're kind of just fooled into thinking, oh well, wow, my taxes were decreased by like 2%. That's the furthest we can get. Or they think, well, I'm making like I don't know, like 50 grand a year, and they're I don't know, maybe they're getting by, and they have a
Hmm.
little bit of disposable income, but that's really it. And they're kind of fooled by the ruling class and by the media into thinking, oh, things are doing great, our economy's great. But overall, it's like our economy either goes into a recession, is in its normal shitty state, or it's doing slightly better than it was doing, and then we consider it's booming. But like, it's only really booming for like the stock market and for like the top 1% of this country. And a lot of people, even if they aren't doing great, they just look at these numbers and like, they either think, oh, only must only be me, or they think, oh well, it's probably actually is going well for me. I'm not working hard enough.
I mean, I fundamentally agree. I think the only other thing I'd really add to that is again point to Hirsch's politics is for power. One of the other big reasons why people don't get organized is they don't have the local organizations to do it. Um,
Yeah,
One of the things that's been really interesting since the 80s, every country has seen a decline of unionization and a decline of like workers' share of income, rising inequality. Every country, pretty much without exception. But the countries that have weathered it the strongest have also been the ones where unions were the strongest beforehand, the Nords. The Nords had the strongest unions before, and they saw the weakest reductions in unions since. Um, there's something about having local organizations, both political and union, worker, and so on, that strengthens power over time. And America has been uniquely bad at doing that for a long time for a variety of reasons.
Yeah. Moving on to another question I had, and I'm happy you brought up fascism earlier. Like in a,
Uh-oh.
I forget which one, I forget which question, but you did bring it up. Um, why do you think fascism is becoming more prominent in recent times, and how do we combat the current capitalist system while also making sure people don't go towards the alt-right pipeline and white supremacist and fascist groups as an alternative to the status quo?
I think the answer for why it's rising is complicated. The main reasons seem to be about what's so-called cultural anxiety. A lot of people
Yeah.
are afraid of the rapid changes that are going on, particularly with relation to like ethnicity in like Europe and the United States. So people are like some people move to the right because of basically, I would say, like increased racialized fear. Um, that's that's part of it. Um, I guess there's also almost certainly a role that social media has to play in it. Social media seems to have further enabled polarization. So where before people would vote for the center right party, now they're voting for the right party, or before they might have voted for the right party, they're voting for the far right party. And similarly, there seems to be an element of this on the left as well. There's been an increase of polarization since the 80s, also back over to the left of people. Um, uh, I guess the main thing I'd note, one of the things I think is really interesting, if you want one person to listen to about this, would be David Shore, Shor. And one of his big takes is fundamentally that the rural vote in America has been getting much more conservative. And part of that is because the rest of society has been getting liberal so much faster, and it's on social issues in particular. So, one of the things that's really interesting is economic views have mostly continued to gradually shift left, but social views have
Huh.
shifted left much faster than economic views have. Just 20 years ago, gay marriage wasn't legal in most countries around the world. Now it's almost the law of the land everywhere, in
Yeah.
the first world anyway. Um, and that's incredibly quick. And the biggest reason why, and I agree with Shore on this one, is basically the rise of education. Um, in America, every year, an additional 0.5% of people get educated. And people who are educated are substantially more socially liberal than the rest of society, like enormously, like 10, 20, 30 points. Um, and if you want a related article, it would be called The Great Awakening by Matthew Iglesias at Vox. It's basically just a series of graphs showing how quickly the white American liberal has moved left on race issues. Um, so I guess the basic take that I would say there is I think part of what we're seeing is a reaction to the rapid shifting left of social values. Some people feel very anxious about it. It's
Hmm.
called this theory of cultural anxiety. And some people feel very anxious about these and are shifting over to the right. I guess the hopium that I would offer is that these terms these seem to be mostly short term. Reactions to a bunch of people like immigrants coming into your country are counteracted in the long term by what's called contact hypothesis. Contact between people reduces distrust. People like marry, people become friends, people fuck. Um, they become normal. The alien becomes normal. Uh, and the other long-term trend is, of course, education. As the world gets more educated, the people are becoming less and less racist. The other hopium stat that I often cite is just 10% of boomers in the Republican Party think that blacks face systemic injustice in the United States. It's 4 in 10 Generation Z, which isn't great, but it's 4 times higher than it was of the
Yeah.
people who are like 60 years older than them. Um, it's a pretty rapid shift, I guess is what I'm trying to get at. Uh,
Yeah. Um, newer generations definitely give a lot of hope, I guess, but
yeah.
there are some nerve wracking things, especially when it comes to like climate. It's like wow, the new generations re- overwhelmingly believe in like climate change existing and things like that,
Yeah.
compared to older generations. But it's like we don't have much time, so is
Yeah.
that enough? I don't know.
Y'all
Um,
need to grow up and vote, okay? I mean that's the real thing, I guess. It would be community
age now.
organizing. Get your fucking age group to vote. If tomorrow we could pass mandatory voting, holy shit. Well,
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah. It's when it comes to like fascism rising and I guess even when I think the biggest historically, I think the thing that comes to mind is Germany. when
Mhm.
Germany was basically an economic ruin. Even it's like both the far left and far right rose in popularity,
Mhm.
and that's what I wonder, because it's like when the status quo becomes utterly hated by your average person, but so much that they become radicalized. It is scary because you don't know which way they're gonna go, because there are so many people that fall into the trap of right wing demagogues who, on the surface
One
level, make convincing arguments because they're either very dishonest. They have a lot of money behind them. They're able
one
to
of the
share their ideology everywhere. It's
one
it
of
is something
Sorry,
that
go ahead.
it is something that's like it can be hard to um navigate around, because it's like you have to first of all convince people that the way things are right now need to be radically changed, and you also have to convince them that your way of doing it is the correct way.
I guess one of the papers that is most interesting to me about on this one is um here, I'll just link it.
Yeah.
Um on like the question of like the working class going which way sort of thing. Um it's this paper which suggests this is a very commonly cited paper. You know the Ben Shapiro talking point that like heterogeneity is why America can't have a welfare state and why Sweden can, right? Because they're homogenous.
Yeah.
So it seems to be correct, but not for the reasons Ben Shapiro is saying. So the basic thesis seems to be that in America, um, when you look at like for example, let's just take the working class or something. A lot of people in the working class are very bigoted. I don't, you can't look at like the statistics and avoid that. The white
Yeah,
working class
sadly,
votes
yeah.
very Republican. Um, yeah. And so I guess one of the ideas is that the working class in Sweden, whether they be racist or not, back in the 1960s, they didn't hate the poor because when they thought about the poor, they didn't think about a black guy. But in America, when the white working class thought about the poor, they thought about a black guy. And so they didn't want to give the poor guy welfare because they were racist. And so the liberal working class voted liberal, but the racist working class voted right. And so right now, I think part of what you're seeing is that the working class in a lot of European countries is now voting right because rather than being racist and still voting to help the poor, they're being racist and trying to fuck over the poor because they see them as alien. Um, it's not a very comforting thesis, but I think it's a really interesting explanatory thesis um, for what you're seeing right now. And again, I think that there is hopium in the long-term trend. In the United States, we've seen enormous long-term trends of racism, um, like truly enormous, but they have taken a very long time. And part of that is due to segregation and the like failure to integrate and like white flight and so on. But it is slowly getting there, and hopefully, European countries are better poised to do it faster than the United States.
Yeah, it's like it's I sometimes think about this because it is interesting to think about um what would have happened if, like, after the Civil War, Reconstruction wasn't severely botched. I
Yeah,
wonder what today would look like, because
I mean, even the Reconstructionists weren't like liberal in the modern sense. But
yeah.
if you had just had like the political integration of blacks still had voting power, and the South had become
Mm,
integrated, it might have been an incredibly different country. The North might
yeah,
have been the racist one for a
yeah,
long
there've
time. The
been
South
a
might have
very
been the
good chance that
anti-racist.
there wouldn't have been segregation. So, I mean, obviously they still would have had still probably win something, but like it wouldn't have been nearly as severe.
Yeah, it's an alt history and it's sad.
Yeah.
Um,
Yep.
I,
Well, okay. This probably can be taken. Next question is probably gonna be taken a lot of ways, but this is taken a lot of ways. Probably one more contentious one, but should a socialist nation export socialism to other nations and try to spread its ideology globally?
yeah, absolutely.
All right.
What's the old line? Democracy anywhere is a threat to sorry, injustice anywhere is a threat
Yeah.
to justice anywhere. Um, I think that fundamentally, both there's two reasons for this. One is the pragmatic, and one is like the moral, I suppose. The pragmatic one is the more people, the more countries that share an ideology close to. It doesn't need just be socialism. It can just be moving countries left, right? The more countries that share an ideology close to you, the less likely they are to like gang up and try and kill you. The less likely they are to embargo you or try and like crush your economy. An entire socialist Americas is much less likely to have problems than if everywhere is socialist in Americas but the United States.
Yeah.
Um, So I think that they should try to export it. What does that mean? I don't necessarily think like intervention. I think that often we're talking about ideally you'd want to talk a lot about soft power. For example, there's a lot of empirical evidence that China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is basically just investing money in countries, changes people's opinion for favorably towards your country. If America were to go socialist or sock them or whatever, it has an enormous cultural capital to change people's minds in favor of left wing ideology. Um, I would focus on those methods, but I do think that there is a reason to do so, and the reason is more, I guess, the moral one as well. So the pragmatic one is, you want to survive. The moral one is you want people to be well, and if you're like a socialist and you don't think that like borders really matter, why would you stop at the border? If borders are just arbitrary, why would you only want people in your country to succeed? I think some people. And I guess this will be my jab at the people on the left. I think some people on the left really adhere to this idea of national sovereignty, despite claiming to be like internationalists. And I think that's absurd. There's no reason why a border should decide like where democracy starts and where democracy ends. Ideally, I would want like the one world federal government or whatever.
Yeah.
So I want like the when the USSA goes when USA becomes the USSA and Comrade Sanders invades Mexico to impose socialism, I will be right behind him. I'll be on the front lines. Okay.
Yeah. That's that's something I've kind of said for a while. It's like, okay, when it comes to countries becoming socialist, most likely it's it's more likely it's gonna happen in South America than anywhere else. Um, because South America seems like they're a lot more open to socialism. Due to since
Yeah.
they tend to be poor countries, it tends to be a lot easier to overthrow governments. It tends to be a lot easier to do things like that. Especially Bolivia comes to mind. But the easiest way for them to not get cooed by the CIA is if multiple uh countries in South America and countries around Bolivia specifically, because Bolivia is moving towards socialism, um, all become
Well, at least social
socialist.
democracy anyway.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but they're not socialist, but
Yeah.
they're moving towards it. If multiple countries in South America become socialist, because then it's harder to coup them. It's harder to embargo them when
Yeah.
many more countries rely on each other.
I mean,
Um,
that's the whole fundamental idea,
yeah.
right? Like what I was trying to say before, way earlier, like when revolution in the third world succeeds, it's got to be somewhere real big, so the United States can't just crush you.
Hmm.
Because usually when it's small, we just crush you. Um, I guess Cuba is the weird exception, but virtually every other country that went left had like a civil war or a U.S. opposition or like a coup, and they
Yeah.
fail. Um, um, I guess I fundamentally agree with that. I think that both are for pragmatic, and I think the moral argument is the one that often appeals to me more. It's just like, just because I happen to be born on this side of the border and you on the other side, why does that mean that like you should have no ability, you should have no influence in my life, and I should have no influence on yours? It just seems absurd, I guess.
Yeah. I think it's I think it's kind of like ingrained in people's minds. It's like, oh, no, they don't live in this piece of land that I live in. So, I mean, what do I care that what their country's doing? Um, it's kind of like I remember like following up on the Bolivian election, and there are some people that are like, well, it's not even your country, so why do you care? That's some people have told me that. I'm like, yeah, I think that a good thing happening anywhere in the world is something to be celebrated, even if it
Well, and I
doesn't
think
directly affect me.
And I guess in an additional argument, it does directly affect. It doesn't directly. It indirectly affects you. So, like one of the things I've talked a lot about is housing first policy, which is something that got really big in Finland. But the Finns got the idea from Americans who tried to do it in a whole bunch of cities, and then the now more recently the UK has started to adopt housing first. Particularly Scotland has adopted, as far
Hmm.
as I'm aware, more of a housing first approach. And so it's this like very progressive, give housing to everyone, regardless of drug status and work status and so on policy, which gets closer to what we might call like housing for all. Um, and there's utility in having left-wing countries that are experimenting with left-wing policy, showing you that it works, and like you can point to it as an example and be like, "Hey, we should be like that country. We should do this policy." If you're the only socialist country around, how can you point to better examples of what you want to be? Um, I think that you need that sort of experimentation if you want to like move forward into socialism, because there will be trials and there will be errors to get like good left-wing policy.
Yeah. Um. I have another question. What can we learn from the failures and shortcomings of past leftist movements?
Of movements, I guess. My suggestion in the United States would be that a lot of left wing movements were just crushed, honestly, by state power. They were infiltrated and destroyed.
Hmm.
So it's really hard to fault them for like whatever good or bad they did. Like the AFL-CIO, for example, was basically a combination of federal pressure and infiltration killed the like left wing part of it.
Yeah, the
Um,
Sedition Acts. So
yeah, like there was the first Red Scare in the tens and twenties when like a lot of lefties were literally shot or like jailed, and then there was a second in the forties and fifties, and they weren't usually shot or jailed. Some were jailed, but usually the movements themselves were just broken apart. And so I you can't fully blame American leftists for that. It's somewhat
yeah,
you can't fully resist the U.S. federal government, as I guess the people who stormed the Capitol are very quickly finding out. Um, I, I guess the main thing that I would focus on is I think that one of the things this will sound like stupid, I guess, or oversimplified. Don't seem scary. I guess would be the suggestion. Try to avoid a third Red Scare.
optics. I guess if you is that what you're?
Optics,
Yeah,
yes. It's that I think that engaging in the electoral process, doing entryism into the Democratic Party, um, maybe not saying the scary parts of the messaging, I guess, is one of the other
yeah.
things I'm constantly talking about. I'm saying don't, even if you're revolutionary, just don't talk about it. Um, I, well, Nazis know this; they know how to hide their power level. um, I am not a revolutionary, and I don't think that you should be revolutionary. I think it is an empirically worse off belief. But I'm willing to work with you. I just think that if you want your ideas to succeed, you should know what tends to get people over to your side. Um, there's this really neat study called agenda seeding about the riots after the assassination of MLK. And one of the simple things that it did is that it showed where there were violence, like violent riots. Here, violence meaning like led by protesters, or violence not led by protesters, because police were often violent to all of them. It was the fucking 60s and they were black.
Yeah.
Um, the important thing, I guess, is the protests that were led by protester violence reduced people. They shifted people to the Republican Party. The protests that were nonviolent shifted people to the Democratic Party. Obviously, Republicans, Democrats are not like socialism and capitalism or something, but the idea in general, and a whole lot of studies replicate this finding, is violence seems to turn people off. People don't like to join violent movements. Um, I would say that trying to have a cohesive entryist movement like the DSA, which allows for ideological diversity and putting resources into actually getting people elected, using that to get media power and political power, passing policies and using those policies to show they work, like Oregon with drug decriminalization. I believe there are goals, there have been various goals to try and get single payer in various states around the country. Um, I guess basically, I think that using that power to show that you can build a better future. Those are all, I guess, the main things I would focus on. So if I had to sum it up, it would be entryism, don't be violent, and don't be scary. Those would be the main three.
Yeah. So I mean,
Sorry, and
it can be
I'm
a
sorry for
bit
all the
hard.
long answers. I don't know how long you want to take for all this.
Nah, it's fine. Um, yeah. I mean, I don't. I would prefer to also, when it comes to protests, to avoid violence at all costs, but sometimes it can obviously if you're having like a mass movement, especially like a BLM, it's impossible to never ever have a single
Yeah,
violent, obviously individuals would do bad things.
it's not like
um
we have like the big BLM switch and we can decide to make it
yeah.
violent or not. Yeah,
um
no,
it
it's a
can be hard
social
though.
fucking movement.
It can be hard though, because it's like you can have a very you can have a pretty peaceful protest, but then you have people on the right or that will just they'll take like instances of violence happening, and they're gonna be
Oh
like,
yeah,
oh, they're terrorists, they're domestic terrorists. They even
you're
this even happened to the civil rights movement and MLK. Like
yeah.
yeah, it did. It
You're
can be
never
hard.
gonna get some people on the right to see your protest as valid, and that's not the point. The point here is not like what some people have called respectability
Yeah.
politics. I don't care if the right respects you.
Hmm.
The goal is, I guess, I'm all of this is geared towards persuasion. I haven't talked too much about like the science of persuasion, but the goal is all one of the big differences between 2016 and 2020 is moderates shifted. They shifted left. Suburban people voted left. Um, the two main trends of 2016 were of 2020 were slightly higher black turnout rate and a significant amount of persuasion. And most of that persuasion happens to moderates. If you want electoral victories so that you can implement leftist policy, those are the people that you've got to switch. I think that the stat, again, to cite David Shore, is that electoral shifts in the United States have been roughly about 80% persuasion and 20% turnout. So unfortunately, I know a lot of people like this idea of drive out the base. Fundamentally, the way that you get electoral victories is by swaying that middle portion. There needs to be
Yeah.
some what he calls messaging discipline. Say the popular things, don't say the unpopular things, win, and then use that power to implement policies that in turn can shift people to be more amenable to your more left-wing policies. Um, that's the general idea.
Yeah. I mean, obviously turnout's important, but it's like it's not the entire. That's not the entire game that you have to play. I mean, it's kind of. I guess you can look. Bernie Sanders, his 2020 campaign. The main thing was youth turnout. Youth turnout. We're gonna drive out the uh, young Democratic base, and I mean, yeah, turnout among the youth did go up,
It went up,
but it did
not
go up.
enough.
It wasn't enough though because every age group also went up. Um,
Yeah,
but yeah, I mean, it is also it is a lesson that I guess it is something that sucks, but you have to learn a lesson from it. Uh, you also
it's just one of these unfortunate empirical realities. There's a fucking paper. I can't remember the name of it. Um, there's a paper which demonstrates that when a partisan candidate gets primaried by a more extreme like partisan candidate, that
mhm.
candidate is more likely to lose. Whether they be on the right or the left. Like one of the big things that happened after the Tea Party movement is more Republicans got elected, but also a whole bunch of more extreme Republicans did not get elected. Um, so I guess the unfortunately one of the problems I guess for like a leftist movement is that probably your messaging can't be too far from the center because you need to be able to persuade people. Now I should note often left-wing economic policies are very popular. It's weirdly enough it's the social policies that you want to pretend to be moderate on. Because that's where Americans are actually more divided. Most Americans love $15 minimum wage. It has like 60,
Yeah,
70%
yeah,
support and so on. It's actually the social stuff that you want to tone down a bit. Which is it sounds a little sketchy. It sounds like I'm like getting to like I don't know NASBall or like
yeah,
classical
yeah.
leftism.
It's like
Like I have like an extremely socially progressive
don't say
person.
that. You hide it.
I have an extremely socially progressive person. It's all about choosing what messages to amplify. I guess is the positive spin I'll give to it. Okay, talk a whole lot about Medicare for all. Talk a whole lot about $15 minimum wage, and mention immigration. Okay.
um, yeah, yeah. I mean, when you ask people like Florida voted for a $15 minimum wage, by a pretty
Yeah.
good margin. They voted for Trump still. I remember there was like a
Yeah, I
was like a
mention it all the time. It's a 53% voted Trump, and I
yeah.
want to say 63% voted
It was
minimum
something
wage. It
like
was like
that.
a
Yeah.
yeah.
There was like a Pew Research poll that came out recently, and it was like a good amount of like poor Republicans even support it. There's
Yeah,
some
no,
yeah
that a majority of poor Republicans, like 53%, want
yeah
$15 minimum wage. And in fact, and I'll send you this article because it's super neat. It's from Data for Progress. Most Republicans don't know that their party opposes the $15 minimum
yeah
wage.
that's
Um, among Republicans, 81% think that their party supports protecting people with pre-existing conditions because they can't imagine their party being so fucking horrific on
yeah
economic
yeah
issues.
yeah
Um,
that's something you
yeah.
see among a lot of Republican voters. There's even some I guess some Democratic voters that I guess are more moderate. There was polls of Joe Biden supporters at their Super Tuesday, and it was like half of them thought he believed in Medicare for all. Like it was
Yeah, no,
rather
it's
it is rather concerning that a lot of it's that high, but it's also a lot. It is kind of the media's fault too to not like inform these people on what these candidates actually believe.
I mean that's one if you want one of the reasons why global fascism has been rising, it's in part due to clickbait driven media.
Hmm.
Social media is just even worse, but regular media has become extremely clickbait driven. Um, one of the things that I constantly mention is there was a neat article, and I'll guess I'm just linking more articles to
Yeah,
you.
it's
There was a
fine.
neat study a few years back. Oh man, where was it? Which demonstrated that the more publicly funded media there was in a given country, the less right wing terrorism there was in said country. Um, and the suggestion, I think, in general, is that publicly funded media tends to be less driven by like clickbait, and if it bleeds, it leads. And a lot of those stories tend to favor the political right because they make people scared of like immigrants and like foreigners and the outside and like trans people or whatever. And so they vote right. But if you just focus on like the facts and like the actual news to some degree, which is what again objectively public media is better at doing that,
Yeah.
they don't. It's Somewhat unfortunate. Really unfortunate, actually.
Yeah, it's yeah, it can be. Okay. But this is actually
I'm
the
sorry for giving you these meaty answers. I do apologize again and
no,
again.
yeah, it's the because I mean I actually was because I'm making a video which I'm as mishmashing a lot of like different answers from
Hmm.
people's same questions. I probably am gonna upload this as its own video anyways, like the whole interview. Um,
Sure.
why not? Like why only use like 10, 15 minutes of it and then not not show the
Yeah.
whole thing. But
Behind the scenes, the director's
yeah,
cut.
yeah. There's actually I actually have only one more question left.
Okay.
Um, lastly, besides from implementing a socialist system and things like that, if you could implement one policy idea in the U.S., what would it be?
Oh God. The one most important thing would be electoral reform.
Hmm.
But that's kind of boring. If I just talk about an actual like economic policy, it would either be a social wealth fund or like public housing,
Yeah,
um, uh, or Medicare for all. Because I, I guess let's talk about like the housing one because
yeah, sure.
housing is the biggest expenditure for the poor. As a percent of income, I think it gets up to 50% for the poorest of the poor. If you want the number one thing you could do to increase the incomes of the poor and therefore decrease income inequality, decrease poverty, it would be a public housing program. Something like a mega beefed up Section 8, where people get a whole lot of money to buy housing. That's actually something Biden is moving in the direction of. He's going to Section 8 is currently only about one fourth funded. So only about one fourth of people who could get housing vouchers get them, but he's going to fully fund them. And that alone apparently might cut poverty by a third. Um, my suggestion is do even more than that. Public building of housing and a sort of YIMBY approach to like housing regulation. Basically, just spamming out housing, making it very affordable. And I guess my other argument here, if you want a more interesting thing to read into, would be that you can use this to do public planning and you can like build well-functioning communities, green housing as part of like the Green New Deal. And a related idea is from Soviet planning, which, I disavow the Soviet system and so on.
Yeah.
There's this idea of micro districts where you put services within walkable distance to people. So you can build not just green communities, but highly walkable and livable communities where you have like medical services and schools and so on right next to housing. So it's very easy for people to do it without crossing streets and so on. It's all kind of right there. So you have this strong sense of community. It's much easier to build organizations in these communities. Um, so micro districts are a very popular thing. They've retained in Russia to this very day. Um, so yeah.
That's that the when it comes to the Soviet Union, that's something I hate to do because like I've seen like some statistics where it's like the innovation in the Soviet Union is actually a good amount higher than the US and a lot but when it came to like statistics when it comes to like the Soviet Union and them doing maybe better than the US in some aspects, I hate citing them because it's the Soviet Union and it makes me
Yeah,
look
because
like I'm
everything they do
defending the
is in the
Soviet
context
Union.
of fucking authoritarian.
Yeah, so
Like,
it's like
yeah.
if I'm actually talking to someone, I probably don't want to cite this because it like just doesn't give the best look.
It's terrible vibes. I mean,
Yeah.
honestly, one of the big optics things is people who spend all their time defending old Soviet regimes, nobody cares. No, that doesn't change people's opinion, or it doesn't change the vast majority of people's opinion. I think what actually changes people's opinion, it tends to be stuff like deep canvassing. It's either personal connection
Hmm.
or literally talking to people and they change their mind. Those are the things that change people's minds. It is not like how good you think the fucking Soviet Union
Yeah,
is.
it's like it's like if someone's like, oh well, capitalism actually helps with innovation, and it's it's like am I really gonna bring up the USSR and then a rebuttal to that and to show that actually, well, some studies show that the USSR had better rates of innovation. Like, I'm not gonna do that. It just doesn't look good. But yeah. Um. Is there anything else you wanted to say?
Um, Sorry for having long answers. um, um, Not really. I think all these are neat articles.
Yeah, I'll look at them.
But yeah, I don't know. That's about
Yeah.
it.
Is
If you want, I guess the only things I was going to recommend that you talk to two people. One is
mhm,
Faraday Speaks. I mentioned him, and then I guess another person would be a friend of mine is Mouthy Infidel, but he would more or less give you the same answers. So,
yeah. I actually
um,
DM Melty Infidel. He never responded, so.
oh
But
my god, I'll chew his ass out.
I'm assuming he never saw it because it didn't say seen, so I don't know.
Okay.
I mean, I understand like not responding to random people who message you on Twitter. Like, I can understand like just not even bothering to check, but
Look, I'm a believer in free speech, okay,
uh-huh.
and free interviews. Anyone who asks it, get it, okay? Conversations for all, that's me.
All right. Well, this is a nice conversation.
Hmm.
Thanks. That's
Sure. Oh,
about
and
it.
when the video gets out, feel free to let me know and I can shout it out
All right. Yeah,
either
that's
on YouTube or Twitter.
all right. Thanks. All right.
Sure. Have a nice evening.
All right. You too. Bye.